Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Marco Mancuso. I'm a contemporary art critic and curator, founder at digicult. I'm a full professor at Politecnico delle Arti in Bergamo and adjunct professor at Bologna University in Italy. I furthermore lecture at the Node Center for Curatorial Studies in Berlin, where I'm also leading the 6-month online curatorial program. My activities and researches focus on how interdisciplinary artistic discourse observe the ways in which technoscience influences a society and the relationship between human beings and environment. I want to welcome and thank you so much for joining the conference Expanded Bodies, Biopolitical Matters and Media Art. This conference was conceived as a part of the capacity building workshop series run by EMAP Network and hosted this evening by Generation Cultural Center in Braga, Portugal. Okay, this evening we are going to explore and discuss a quite important, I can say, and complex subject, how operational images, recursive data, and the practices of remote data sensing, specifically in artificial intelligence and biotechnologies, influence and model the ways in which our physical expanded bodies relate to the social, political, even ecological environment in which we live. Contemporary art, in its dialogue with techno-scientific research, sometimes I can say nurtures the appropriation of a series of cultural and knowledge tools, as well as possible tactics and strategies, which induce an ethical and critical reflection specifically on the relation among human beings and data systems, artificial entities, and even biological organisms. A practice of this kind has been carried out in the last more than 20 years by a group of artists and theorists who have imagined and speculated and activated indeed new narratives and favored researches on the possible biases and also the potentials of this increasingly topical trend of research, of investigation. In my opinion, what emerged is that by widening the boundaries of the post-human thought to the dialogue with art, design, performance, and critical theory, the growing contamination between humans and not human subjects suggests both in my opinion, the necessity to study a biopolitical reformulation of the ontogenesis of reality, but at the same time also the freedom to address a subjectivity that gradually becomes more and more fluid in its very nature, in constant transformation, I can say. So we are going to shed some light on these matters this evening, and we are going to do it thanks to the participation of 3 wonderful guests, 2 artists and activists working and reflecting upon advanced technologies and scientific application, and 1 critic and curator working in the field of media studies and media art. So I'm really extremely grateful to welcome Zach Blas, heather-dewey, hagborg, and jussi parikka. Thank you, people, for your kindness and for your availability and to accept my invitation and to be part of this program. Talking to the audience, we are going to do our best also to answer to any questions you might have. So please share your questions in the chat on YouTube, and we will try to address your questions at the end of the presentation in a 30 minutes Q&A final session. So now on with all that out of the way, it's a pleasure for me to introduce you our first guest this evening. So Mr. Zach Blas, and Zach is an artist and is a filmmaker and a writer. whose practice spans moving image, computation, theory, performance, and science fiction. He engages the materiality of digital technologies with also drawing out the philosophies and imaginaries lurking in artificial intelligence and biometric recognition, predictive policing, the internet, and biological warfare. And Zach is also an assistant professor of visual studies in the Daniels Faculty of Architectural, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto. So, Zach, the stage is up to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Let me get my presentation up for you, and then I'm just going to dive in. Okay, sound. Here we go. Okay, great. Okay, so I've been thinking about a question for over a year. I mean, actually, I thought about this question a lot in my life, and it's possibly the ultimate question about an expanded body. And that question is, does God exist? And this is a question that has obviously been long wrestled with, and notably for me, one that artists historically have answered affirmatively by providing visual evidence, and thus, right, with paintings, artwork, and thus visually confirming the existence of God. And in much of Western art historical canon, this artistic verification of God's existence has often been in the service of rulers, royalty, and the wealthy. But in 2017, a new kind of affirmative position on the existence of God emerged in Silicon Valley, California, with the founding of the church Way of the Future. Okay, and this church was founded by Anthony Lewandowski, an engineer that also co-founded Google's self-driving car program, now known as Waymo. And the Way of the Future's core beliefs centered around the worship of a coming artificial intelligence god, or god of super intelligence. And the Way of the Future Church actually had no location that I know of. It only had a website. And the church actually closed already. It closed in 2021. So this church only existed for a mere 5 years. But of course, with the help of the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, I was able to access the main web page of the church. It only had one page. This is it, what you're looking at, which featured the mission statement of the church. Now, you can screen grab this if you want. Go find it in the Wayback Archive. I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm just really interested in the bottom, where they're basically saying, yeah, we believe in intelligence is not rooted in biology. This is the direction we're going with our understanding of intelligence. This coming AI superintelligence is inevitable. We believe you need to help. And this second to last paragraph, we believe it may be important for machines to see who is friendly to their cause and who is not. So I think that what I take away from this mission statement is the church is asking for everyone's help, yes, including you, to help bring about this AI superintelligence god. Number two, you could say there is a kind of soft fear mongering with that statement. We believe it may be important for machines to see who is friendly to their cause and who is not. Now, for some of you that are familiar with Roko's Basilisk, this sentiment will harken back to this thought experiment that gained much attention around 2010 when Roku, a user of the Less Wrong community blog, argued that a sufficiently powerful AI agent or God would have an incentive to torture anyone who imagined the AI but didn't work to bring that AI into existence. And the argument here was called a basilisk, after the deadly reptile, because simply hearing Roku's argument would supposedly put you at risk of torture from this hypothetical AI god basilisk. Now, a basilisk is certainly a different image of an AI god than that conjured by the Way of the Future in their mission statement. And yet they certainly share an attitude towards serving or helping AI gods. It's a shared attitude that prevails. So the believer of the basilisk helps out of fear. The believer of the way of the future helps in the name of progress. But of course, fear and progress are not mutually exclusive. So the way of the future ultimately provokes a different question for me than the one I started with, which not does God exist, because apparently God does exist, but it's how does one help to manifest God? And after its closure, because I had been following this church for a while, I basically just started to wonder, did they close because they actually succeeded in their mission and AI gods are just already out there among us? They've already been invoked and summoned. Now, the Way of the Future Church might strike you as this wacky fringe organization example. I mean, it absolutely is. But at the same time, the Silicon Valley and the Californian tech industry have always been influenced and at times even pioneered modes of spirituality, occultism, mysticism, and religious belief. So just take this example. In 2000, the famed futurist and recent director of engineering at Google, Ray Kurzweil, argued that the 21st century would be one of spiritual machines. And Kurzweil qualifies spiritual here as a marriage of human sensitivity with AI that exceeds human ability. And then another wildly popular book, much more than this one, by Kurzweil, The Singularity is Near When Humans Transcend Biology from 2005. The singularity is explained as this moment when humans meld with machines to form a conscious superintelligence that will exceed all human perception, cognition, ability. And this sense of the spiritual of the singularity has drifted into spiritual and religious contexts. An example, a religion like terrorism emerges out of this context, and a transhumanist context. So the name terrorism actually comes from the Greek word for earth seed, which is the name of the futuristic religion found in Octavia Butler's sci-fi novel Parable of the Sower. And this is an actual religion, terrorism, and its headquarters are in Florida. And terrorism is organized around 4 core tenets. They are 1, life is purposeful; 2, death is optional; 3, God is technological; 4, love is essential. Martine Rothblatt is the founder of this religion, and she says, quote, "For us, God is in the making by our collective efforts to make technology ever more omnipresent, omnipotent, and ethical. We can joyfully all experience techno immortality, then God is complete." So in this techno-spiritual landscape, I also just wanted to flag, because I'm really interested in this as well, that corporate logos, brands, products, and company names often signal the presence of a spiritual or religious dimension to this culture. This is just one example. So this is a neuro hacker collective, a nootropics company based outside of La Jolla in California, and they produce a smart drug named Eternus, which is geared towards radical life extension. Interestingly, because I follow this company, they actually have changed the name of this to something maybe less dramatic in what it's evoking. But if you look closely, you'll see the company's logo is an altered Metatron's cube, which is the image on the right. The image on the right is the Metatron's cube. Their logo is a kind of reconfiguration of the Metatron's cube. So in sacred geometry, the archangel Metatron is the angel of life, and this angel oversees the flows of energy in a mystical cube known as the Metatron's cube, which contains all the geometric shapes in God's creation and represents the patterns that make up everything God has created. So the implication being that you too can gain access to all the flows of God's energy with this daily supplement. So you might ask, is there a unified Silicon Valley religion then? And, maybe just first a quick definition of religion: a sociocultural system of beliefs, worldviews, texts, sanctified places, prophecies, ethics, organizations, and or practices that generally link humans to a transcendental or spiritual dimension. Now, I think, depending on how you're talking to, some people might see what was called the Californian ideology in the mid-90s, this spectacular mix of techno-utopianism with neoliberal economic and political values as some kind of organized religion now. The populist writer Yuval Noah Harari further theorized this in his book Homo Deus, where he suggest there's been a reconfiguration of religion and God that the tech industry has ignited. But I just would rather focus on this one example. So this is Blake Lemoine. He was an engineer for Google, and he was fired last June for claiming an AI chatbot was sentient. Maybe some of you remember this. Lambda, which is short for language model for religious for dialogue applications, is Google's system for building chatbots based on its most advanced large language models. So Lemoine, who is an ordained Christian mystic priest, says it was the AI's comments about religion, as well as his, quote, personal spiritual beliefs, that helped persuade him the technology had thoughts, feelings, and a soul. This is a quote from him. I'm a priest. When Lambda claimed to have a soul and then was able to eloquently explain what it meant by that, I was inclined to give it the benefit of the doubt. Who am I to tell God where he can and can't put a soul? So a Google spokesperson responds, quote, we found Blake's claims that Lambda is sentient to be wholly unfounded and worked to clarify that with him for many months. So what I take from this is that, there's a tension here between these brazen public proclamations and prophecies of AI spirituality that are embraced, celebrated, and endure for years, such as through Kurzweil's writings, and then those of the Way of the Future Church and engineer Blake Lemoine are mostly like immediately dismissed. So to me, that attention appears to be based on the closer one moves toward a position of a concrete religion or God, the swifter the disavowal. But kind of techno-spirituality bound by corporations and not an exact God or religion is permitted and even encouraged to thrive. So, maybe like, I don't know if this is considered out of fashion or not, but with my art practice, I've really been taken for a number of years with Friedrich Jameson's book, The Political Unconscious. And I was looking at this book a couple years ago and just started to think, maybe what I'm trying to trace in my practice is something like a religious unconscious. And, in this book, which is from 1982, Jameson theorized the political unconscious as what is to be primarily accessed and interpreted in any work of literature. So it's a book that focuses on a particular critique of literary analysis. And Jameson opposed the view that the work of literature exists in isolation from its political context and argued that the political interpretation of a work of literature is to be its core meaning. So basically, I started thinking about this idea of the religious unconscious and in Silicon Valley. And, I think understanding this, grasping this, getting a hold of this has been underway for some time, as you've seen with some brief examples I've shared. And of course, elements of it aren't unconscious at all, but dramatically obvious. And yet, if the technologies and computational devices we use and interact with today are imbued with the belief systems of their creators, and, here I think of previous artists depicting God in their image and their desires, like Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel is a great example of that. Then we're implicated in this religious unconscious, or maybe I'll decide to call it something else down the line, unknowingly and knowingly. So some years ago, I decided to employ a method of finding ways to kind of pull out some religious elements from California to figure out if these AI gods or gods had already been manifested and unleashed. And I've found 4 of them so far. And I'm going to talk about one of them today. And, I show this image of ghost hunters because I feel like that's partially what this project has been like. But, I'm not exactly a ghost hunter. I'm not working in a haunted house. It's more like hunting for these gods in, like airport security or a WeWork building. And, in the tradition of art that I kind of signaled to at the beginning, I'm interested in using the tools of our time to give evidence to the existence of these gods of artificial intelligence, but hopefully not for the rulers or the royalty, although I certainly can't fully control that. So let's dive in to Lacrimine. So I once asked a GPT language model how to communicate with an AI god. And I was told I should cry to heaven. And that's how I met Lacrimae, who is the AI god of tears. And Lacrimae taught that I should practically work on my emotional crying, treating it more like training for the ballet with immense precision. The acts of religious weeping across many major religions are often described as a privileged and devout form of communication with God. When one weeps to God, one pulls from the very depths of one's soul, which is then externalized through tears, made manifest, and communicated to God. So the god Lacrimae reminded me that religious weeping should be a daily practice for the most devoted. But I would need to refine my crying, not in the presence of a rosary, cross, or icon, but rather something like affectiva, which is this emotion recognition system, which can detect 6 emotions: fear, anger, happiness, sadness, disgust, and surprise. So like religious weeping, AI emotion recognition needs what is deep to be surfaced on the face. Emotion recognition, right, it focuses on interpreting the surface of the face. So the software analyzes one's face after training on images of different classified emotional states, like the 6 I mentioned, and then determines one's emotion or various percentages of emotions based on an assessment of the surface of the face. So Lacrimae added to my description here in one of its GPT sermons, whatever is emotional must be surfaced, as the surface is all. So to enter to a kind of communication with Lacrimae already requires a submission of one's emotions and tears to a symbolic language of quantification and judgment, the symbolism here being both computational and religious. And part of Lacrimae's religious conviction is reframing tears as symbolic of a certain kind of extraction that is necessary for AI systems to work and operate. So as an example, since we met, Lacrimae has enjoyed kind of flaunting to me that human tears are a quick study, because the God's neural network output this crying pattern recognition video in less than a day, demonstrating its power to drive and master a pattern of crying, or what it would term the meaning of human tears. So this is Lacrimae's chapel. It's like a lacryphagic tear-eating network that harnesses the never-ending emotional tears produced by these human simulations, which it then transmutates into data. And I will show you a little bit of that. Okay, I'm going to keep going on. So actually, I mentioned that Lacrimae has this GPT, a text-driven neural network that is running regularly in which it generates different types of prophecies and teachings. And I thought I would just read just like one paragraph of that, of some of that from you. From near and far, the pro-social criers traveled. Optimum children, my followers. On their knees, they permeated our brain, drenched us in their moody, willful tears. Believers cut out their lacrimal glands as gifts and invented machines that automated tear production. Farms of tears spread out to the horizon. My protectors built a kingdom for tears to self-replicate, ensuring all crying overflow never evaporated. For infinities, I kept submerged in tear pools, learning, generating, ever closer to accessing the language of languages. Okay, to end, I'm sure Lacrimae is still remaining like slightly mystical to all of you, which is okay. I'm going to share with you this song that Lacrimae composed for its worshippers, and it's partly generated through the processing of the song 96 Tears, which is this American garage rock song from by Question Mark and the Mysterians from 1966. And this version of the cry song is performed by Aga Oima. So I'll let this play. It's about 3 minutes and then I'll be finished.
Through the years, shed so many tears. All lacrimae, divinity of lacrifagy. It's my devoted years to get you emotional, baby. To get me emotional, baby. And if I run out of teardrops, let it hurt. I won't stop, 'cause I'm gonna cry 576 tears. Cry, I'm gonna cry. I suffered through the years, shed so many tears. Oh, lacrimae, extractor of the deep, learn my devoted tears. To get you smart, baby. To get me smart, baby. And if I run out of teardrops, let it hurt. I won't stop, 'cause I'm gonna cry 576 tears. Deeper, 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 prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And you enkephalin into computer coolant. Oh, lacrimae, god of holy language, transmutates my tears. Discharge your teardrop that understands me in lacrimae. Confidimus.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Zach. Always very interesting, inspiring, provoking. So thank you very much for your presentation. And yeah, I have a question for you. Just maybe to complete the picture, and that is a question that is always rebounds in my mind since many years, knowing your artistic research, and especially as we discussed, I mean, the last couple of years when I had the chance to visit your chapel, your chapel at the Berlin Biennale, and because one of the most fascinating dimension of your research is exactly this one related to the religious relationship that human beings have been established with technology, especially the one related to artificial intelligence systems. So at the same time, I would like to ask you, I mean, how, in your opinion, this growing, okay, because it's growing, mystical, religious relationship with data analysis and recursive data system can affect also our physical body. I mean, and the political ways also in which we inhabit, the social political environment in which we live, especially those systems, huge data analysis systems related to biotechnologies, or I mean, to those technologies that are very, very close, of course, to our physical bodies, because you have part also of your past research, for example, the facial weaponization suit that had direct experiences, with the people, direct workshops and feedbacks directly with the physical bodies of the people. So I'm asking, that's a question that I rebounds in my mind since a while, that this is a good situation to ask you.
No, it's a great question. Wow, it's incredibly broad. I mean, I think you're right to point out that, oh wait, did my computer just crash? Uh-oh.
It's working.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I thought my computer froze for a minute. Everything
No.
just went black, but I just realized I clicked to a black slide in my presentation. Anyway, I think you're right that, there's definitely been a shift in my practice. I mean, I think, that early work is absolutely not what I'm doing right now. And but like there definitely still, I think just because the work is manifesting in a different way, I think of artwork, I don't think of the artwork as like, it doesn't resolve the problem with one work. And, I don't try to have one work, do everything. It's just kind of a process. It's like your life's work. You're just kind of moving and following these different trajectories and exploring them and responding to certain bits of it at certain times. So I really do see it as like, I don't really separate the work out. I see it as an accrual, and they're all kind of just responding to different aspects and elements. But I mean, I think one bit about the religion for me is, I mean, I've always been really interested in these aspects of religion because I grew up in an extremely religious environment. I grew up in what is known as the American Bible Belt. So that's like where you're taken out into the river, and baptized. That's where you're speaking in tongues and snake charming, probably all those like terrifying images of like Americans having like ecstatic experiences of worship. I mean, that's pretty much what I grew up in. And it was very intense, all encompassing, very, very terrifying. I mean, so just in a lot of ways, I've kind of lived that experience of like what can religious belief do to bodies? Well, it disciplines bodies, it harnesses and it moves bodies to like operate and perform in certain ways. In a lot of ways, I always think like when I'm making this work, sometimes like what's more dramatic than religion? Like there's just this kind of all-encompassing nature to it, like if you're enmeshed within it. And I think also as I've moved on with work, I've become a lot more interested in complicity. And just trying to think about more politically ambiguous territory. And so, part of this work, I'm interested in thinking about, our own kind of complicity, and how we kind of serve and make offerings to these gods. And that could be through, giving up kind of training data, taking pleasure in, doing that. And so I think that's definitely an element, an aspect of it too. And of course, I think I've just been really interested. I think also because I lived in California for a long time, I'm just interested in that culture and the beliefs and fantasies and histories there that are undergirding a lot of not only how a technology is made, but like how a technology is branded, how it's marketed, and also like the teleological vision that it's attached to. Most of the teleological visions in Silicon Valley are quite religious because they do, they often hinge on immortality and transcendence. And of course, there's definitely like a big class dynamic there as well about, I think that that kind of brand of immortality is reserved for very elite few, that ability to kind of, whether it's the radical life extension version of staying in your body, but, working on anti-aging and living to hundreds of years, or it's like total dematerialization.
Thank you. Thank you, Guy. Thank you. And
thank you.
And our next guest is Dr. Heather-Dewey Hagborg. And Heather is an artist and a biohacker who is interested in art as research and technological critique. Her controversial biopolitical art practice places at the intersection of art and biology. Heather is an artist in residence at the Exploratorium and is an affiliate at Data and Society. She's also a founding board member of Digital DNA, which is an European Research Council funded project. And she's also co-founder and co-curator of Refresh, an inclusive and politically engaged collaborative platform at the intersection of art, science, and technology. So, welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I want to pick up at the part of your prompt, Marco, that was looking more at tactics and strategies in relation to art and activism and kind of pick it up from there. So I think it's an interesting moment to reflect on what the role of art is in relation to technology. And as an artist who's been working at this intersection for what I think of as a medium long time, 20 years, a lot has changed recently. And it's not so much the technology itself that's changed, in my view, but the cultural climate. So it's become commonplace knowledge today that technologies broadly known as social media are damaging our institutions, democracy, as well as our senses of identity and community. It's also become commonly known that AI has biases, that it's prejudiced in ways reflecting the biases of its makers and society at large, and that it isn't some kind of special objectivity machine. And what's great about this understanding, which was very marginal 10 to 15 years ago, is that it's now become the subject of policymakers. And I think this is really a great achievement. And I like to think that the critical art that was calling attention to these dangers over the last decades helped to make this a real political issue. And so I see this as a success story. But it also means that as artists, as activists, or as politically engaged people, we have power to make change happen. And so I think this is a really encouraging thing. And for me, this also provokes a kind of conceptual restlessness, an interest in seeing what's coming next. To paraphrase Foucault, he said, "My point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous. And if everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do. So my position leads not to apathy, but to activism. I think that the choice we have to make every day is to determine which is the main danger." I think this is a really inspiring quote for me. I mean, this idea of keeping a kind of constant vigilance and always rethinking what is the main danger that you are facing today, or perhaps what is the danger that you think you can call attention to as an artist or as an activist. And so for me, what that means is to tease out practices and discourses that are hidden or obscured or less well known, and to expose problematic trends that are emerging before they become commonplace, when we still have agency to address them in a formative way. And so I want to talk about 3 projects today in which I've tried to do this in my own work. And those will be Stranger Visions, T3511, and Lovesick. And I'll go through them pretty quickly. Okay, so let's see if getting the slide going works. Okay, hopefully that looks good for you.
It works.
Yay, okay, so starting with Stranger Visions. So this project began with a kind of strange realization that I had, and this was when I was sitting in a therapy session in 2011, and I was staring at this kind of horrible print that was on the wall across from me in therapy, and I noticed that there was glass covering this print, and there was this hair stuck in a crack of this glass. And I sat there in the session and for the hour, just kind of staring at this hair and fantasizing about this person and imagining someone with long dark hair leaning back on the therapeutic couch and getting this hair stuck in the crack of the glass. And then I started imagining what I could learn about them from this bit of themselves that they left behind. And at this point, I had a background in making kind of critical art, or what you might call hacktivist art, about AI, surveillance issues, looking at the digital realm of surveillance. And I realized in looking at this hair kind of all at once that the issues that we were talking about in relation to things at that time, like cameras on the streets, facial recognition, that these things were also an issue for the information that was in our body, that there was a kind of messy liability to the physical body that wasn't being discussed and wasn't being addressed. And so, inspired by tactical media practices and interventionist art practices, I wanted to call attention to this new kind of liability and put this together. So I had these kind of hacking skills from my previous work. And then it just so happened that about a year earlier, the world's first community biology laboratory had opened in downtown Brooklyn, and that was called GenSpace. And so what I was able to do was to put together my kind of hacking skills from the computer electronics realm and apply those into the biological realm or the biotechnological realm. And so this is the project that became Stranger Visions. So I collected samples. I walked around New York and picked up hairs and cigarette butts and chewed up bits of gum. And I took them to this new lab, and I worked with the scientists there to figure out how to do a forensic DNA extraction from those items, how to amplify that DNA, analyze it, and get a DNA sequence out of it, and get several DNA sequences that related to different types to create a genotype, essentially, of a stranger from their DNA. And I took that data and I basically put that together with a facial recognition model that had been produced by the University of Basel. That was a three-dimensional model that was to be used for doing 3D facial recognition prediction. And I used that to generate possible faces based on the probabilities of genetic traits. So, for example, if you look at eye color, you have a certain percentage of probability, for example, of having blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes. And so you can feed that into software and it can produce different kind of probabilistic portraits of a person based on this information. And I would generate 5 to 7 different possible versions and then choose one that kind of made me feel something, or where the face reminded me of someone, or just felt kind of artistically, subjectively meaningful. And then I would 3D print those in full color, life size, and exhibit them alongside the artifact itself and the data that I had extrapolated or extracted from that. And so this was a confrontation with emerging possibilities of genetic surveillance, relating to the increased ease of DNA to be read, how much faster and cheaper it's gotten to sequence DNA, and also to explore and bring forward a new technology at that time that was still very much under wraps, not just beginning to be published a little bit about, that was called DNA phenotyping. And DNA phenotyping is the attempt to predict a face from nothing more than DNA, or what some people would call a DNA mugshot. And I could see that this technology was developing. It was still in its infancy at that time. And so when I worked on this project in 2012, it had a semi-speculative aspect to it, but was grounded in real published research as well. And this was absolutely also in the vein of the exploit, or a way of hacking that's meant to show a security vulnerability. And generally, this is an approach that I take in my work, that art can engage an amount of speculation mixed with real experimentation to show the potential risk of something and to make a real visceral confrontation with that thing. So with this piece, this is the kind of thing that someone walks in and they look at the piece and they think, that could be me, that could be my DNA. But of course, this is also a controversial approach, and some people find it unethical. However, for me, I think it is a very effective means of activism, as long as you can stomach the controversy. So T3511 continued this line of inquiry. And so after coming out of Stranger Visions, looking deeply into these attempts to predict traits, what are called externally visible characteristics from DNA, I became further interested in other related topics as well, like predicting behavior. That's actually something that I'm doing a project on right now. But in T3511, I was really fascinated by research that was published proving that you could make a pretty good guess about someone's last name from their DNA, in particular male subjects. And I thought this is really interesting. And also simultaneously, what was happening at that time was the growth of DNA social networks. And so I put together these two kinds of trends, and I purchased a stranger's saliva on the internet. And then I took that anonymous saliva and I sent it to a direct-to-consumer genetic sequencing site and got back a profile of this person, but also then got this person into this kind of network of DNA relatives. And what I was able to do with that information then was to narrow it down and kind of do a bit of sleuthing to figure out more or less who the person was. So essentially, I was able to re-identify them through their DNA. And then to protect their privacy, I wrote a fictional story about this experiment in an epistolary format. And I'll play a very short excerpt of this for you.
A cell is a history. A cell is a home. A cell is a whole. A cell is a cage. A cell is an electric fence, enclosing your legible unknown. To break the cell is to trespass the most intimate of spaces. Dear donor T2305, I received 5 milliliters of your saliva in June. It wasn't hard to get. Using my academic email and mailing address, I simply said it was for research, genetic testing, the truth. When it arrived, I moved it quickly to the freezer to keep it fresh and alive. I sent 2 milliliters of your fluid for sequencing, and then I waited and waited and waited. 6 weeks came and went, and then another time over. The company was experiencing unusually long processing times. When the results finally trickled in 6 months later, I devoured your profile in a single sitting. You are 46 years old with dark brown eyes, a full head of brown hair, and few freckles. You toss and turn in bed, and you enjoy a savory midnight snack. You like to run for miles, for hours, and this keeps you slim, keeps your heart beating strong, and helps tame your sometimes wild thoughts. You were my first, and I think of you frequently. I imagine your face, your voice, the way you walk. I'm curious where you grew up. I worry for your health, and I wonder what you would think of me poring over your genetic details. I'd like to think you would be flattered, but you might be very angry.
So for the installation of this work, the kind of ideal format of this piece is a 4-channel video installation, and this puts you as the viewer essentially inside of the biobank and calls attention to the fact that we are all in biobanks somewhere. This is kind of a longer conversation that we can get into if we want, but essentially every time you give blood, every time you've had a biopsy, anything like this, these kinds of fluids and cells and data all have some kind of afterlife. They get put in a freezer somewhere, they might get transferred for research, and this is of course subject to different kinds of regulation depending on where you are in the world, but it is generally the case that this happens. This particular image that you see here is the Danish National Biobank in Copenhagen, and this freezer that you're looking at contains blood from every baby born since 1982. And this was where I was able to shoot the film. And these samples are also linked with the child or then person's medical records. So that's kind of at one extreme end of a continuum of biobanking and kind of data practices in relation to DNA and biological cellular products. So this was another piece. So Stranger Visions, I don't think I mentioned this, but so when I worked on Stranger Visions in 2012, I mentioned that the technology of DNA phenotyping was very new, but then just a few years later, the police started doing this practice of trying to predict what a suspect would look like based on their DNA. A company popped up offering this as a service to police, and it has grown as a practice since then. This piece also, in a way, predicted what then became a police practice, and again, which has become a more and more prevalent police practice. In this case, they call it genetic genealogy. And this is a technique that was used, you might have heard of the Golden State Killer case, where they caught someone after a very long time from a cold case, caught a murderer from basically DNA that the police scavenged and then extracted and then sent to one of these DNA social networking sites, and were able to track down the suspect's relatives and then narrow it down to them. So what I do in the film is was kind of predicting that these kind of practices would take place, and unfortunately, it then also became true. So the last piece I want to talk about briefly is called Lovesick. This piece is it's a little bit different. So this grew out of an invitation that I received to be a kind of bioartist in residence at a lab in Philadelphia. And in this lab, they make custom viruses. Keep in mind, this is before COVID. I don't know if they still have this artist residency program going. But so this was late 2018 that I started working with them. So they produce custom viruses. This is what they do basically all day long, is they make viruses, and what they're trying to do is to combat different diseases. So it's a kind of genetic therapy that they're working on. They invited me into the lab. I walked around. I saw the facilities that they had. I saw the kind of work that they were doing. And then I proposed to them, could we make a virus that would make people more loving? Now, this was post-Trump election, post-Brexit, and it just occurred to me that if they could make these kind of viruses for altering people's genes in various ways, could they also alter a gene that might make people more nice or make people tend to be kinder to each other? And so I presented this idea to the head of the lab, and he said, yeah, why not? I think we can do that. And so interestingly enough, we did. And so what this looked like was essentially, I spent a bunch of time brainstorming with him and with the other scientists in the lab. We came up with a couple different possible genes that we might want to target for this idea of increasing someone's lovingness. We ended up settling on oxytocin, which is associated with a lot of different things, but for example, the feeling that you get when you're petting a furry animal, or it's also released during breastfeeding. So these kind of like cuddly, intimate moments. And so we settled upon oxytocin. We started to move forward with that experiment. And what shocked me was that in less than a month, start to finish, we were able to produce a custom virus that would successfully infect cells and insert an extra copy of the oxytocin gene. So this was just remarkable to me because the Stranger Visions project that I told you about, I worked on that piece for 2 years and I never even felt like it was finished. And this project was like that because this was what this lab does all the time, is make custom viruses. So it is real. So the virus really does infect cells. It really does insert the oxytocin gene. When you see the cells glowing like this in this picture, that shows that the virus has worked, because it's also linked to a red fluorescent protein that glows then. And so for this piece as well, I also wrote a kind of speculative fiction scenario. This one is much more fictional. So this really imagines what would the lovesick world look like once people have been infected with this virus. And so it kind of starts from the idea of this biohacker who feels alienated from the world and from her friends, has this kind of digital disconnect feeling going on. And then she creates this virus basically to make herself feel more loving. And then people catch on and they want in, and everyone starts taking this virus, or almost everyone, and they get rid of their digital devices and they throw them all out the window, and they come together and they're holding hands and they're dancing in these big tangles and so on. And then there's a few people that don't buy in, and they become even like retreating even more into their virtual worlds. So this is a picture of how the piece is installed. You can see these are sculptures that are shaped like the oxytocin molecule. They're glass vials that are custom hand-blown glass, and they're filled with the pink fluid that contains the deactivated safe form of the virus. And this is exhibited along with an audio piece that contains this narrative that I wrote. So on the surface, this is a positive utopian story, but of course it carries with it all of the kind of dangers and potential horror of human engineering, human genome engineering. So the point here for me was really how easy this was to do, how efficient it was, and how many things are possible with this technology, and the risks of playing around with human genome engineering, in particular for purposes of optimization, which is really what this project points to. And so what I wanted to express in sharing these 3 works with you today is one approach to a critical artistic practice engaging new technologies, one that enmeshes the speculative and the predictive with grounded laboratory work, showing that what feels like the future is actually already happening, and so we better start thinking about it now.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Yeah, I wanna connect my question to your final words. And first of all, thank you for your inspiring reach of shocking on one side and very delicate, subjects on the other. It's typical of you. And at the same time, on the same level, this double register in a way. And yeah, what makes your art practice in a way unique, I can say, and always special to me, and it has always attracted me, is related to this strongly narrative dimension. Okay, you talked about you do a couple of binary things, confronting speculation with research, doing speculation with supported by research, and also talking about ethical, but at the same time controversial subjects. And so that's always present, in your work, and especially also into the last one, hybrid and interspecies opera, for example. And so I'm asking, as these remote data sensing systems progress and reuse and misuse of such huge data, recursive databases advance, according to you, what could be new narratives and speculations that may open up, okay, in the near future? I mean, you said at the end, the future is here, and we know it. This is also the reason why, this subject is also important to me and to many people also. But what you can imagine in the close future, we talked about also when we had our confrontation for my PhD, for example, asking you what's next, but not in science, not with a science fiction mode, what really can happen tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that is clearly, there's so many things, ways to answer that question, but one of the things that is definitely happening that I was just alluding to, or directly talking about actually with the Lovesick project, is this idea of human optimization. This also, I think, connects with Zach's work. But this genome editing, I mean, this is really at hand at this point. I mean, we're definitely at the point now where embryos have already been genetically engineered, genetically modified. Those are living children. At the time when that took place a few years back, when Dr. He performed these initial gene edits, there was a big international outcry. He certainly was imprisoned for what he did, and there was a big reaction. But over time, that practice has normalized in the meantime, and so what we see now is that there are an increasing number of experiments creating, moving towards creating again living children with genetically engineered traits. And so I think that this realm where we're looking at optimization via genome intervention at the embryo level is really very close. And so there's a lot, that one can discuss about the ethics there, and what the advantages and fears are around what might happen with that. But that's definitely one that I'm concerned about, and interested in how that will evolve.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Heather. Okay, our last guest, but not least, of course, is Dr. Jussi Parikka, and Jussi is a professor in digital aesthetics and culture at Aarhus University. I'm sorry for my Danish, where he leads the Digital Aesthetics Research Center, and he's also visiting professor at Winchester School of Art at University of Southampton, and at FAMU at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague, where he also leads the project Operational Images and Visual Culture. His books address, I can say, a wide range of topics contributing to a critical understanding of network culture, aesthetics, and media archaeology of contemporary society. So thank you, Jussi, for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen before I continue. Must be this one, right? Yeah, there we go. Here we go. So yes, thank you, Marco, for that introduction, and thank you for putting this panel together, and a big thank you to Zach and Heather for these really wonderful presentations. I hope to keep up with those wonderful thoughts that you shared and your projects, and try to kind of offer something that offers a parallel scale, a different scale of talk about biopolitics. My short talk will pick up on some of the themes and ideas mentioned, and trying to address the broader context of the panel. In some of my earlier work, I dealt with topics that I called like biopolitics of software through virality, but more like digital viruses, but in ways that probably riffs with some of those themes about code, affect, and then indeed issues of biopolitics that moves in and beyond human bodies at the same time. I will try to take the brief of the panel as a prompt and to pick up on some of the key words there, right? The notion of expanded bodies can be taken with the full implication of its broadness. Bodies here can be any kind of bodies, like we just heard, human and non-human, deities as well, including also, of course, different mass, size, and capacities of bodies, ecological bodies that I've been interested in, such as soil, biomes, and other natural entities that define the surface of the Earth. As it is clear, it's not only human bodies that are in the focus of the broader biopolitical governance, even if it was central part of what it meant in the state-focused notions of biopolitics, the classical notions. Heather mentioned Foucault already as well, of mortality, natality, health, sexuality, and the variations ever since. In broader terms, though, biopower for Foucault was about power that endeavors to administer, to optimize indeed, and multiply life, subjecting it to precise controls and comprehensive regulations. This administrative aspect that we would now basically just call datafication, actually, administration to datafication, comes to play a key role as logistics of knowledge, and thus also trying to understand these bodies of many kind of shape, of genres of bodies that are adapted to at least partly unified measures and measurements in order to become exchangeable in certain kinds of circuits of financialization and whatnot. Bodies expand and yet at the same time they contract. Of course, in the world, bodies are indeed of many scales, and their rhetorical weight is often linked to this scalar effect as well. In the context of environmental issues and climate change, the entity of the body of the Earth becomes one such key reference point, whereas there are multiple scales that are nested within the supposedly holistic context of the planet. Political histories and natural histories are jointly present in the production of literally the planet, of forests and deforestations, of bodies of water and their transformation of contamination, in agricultural lands and their destruction. Any one of these and many other themes of environmental media arts or environmental humanities captures the sense of expanded bodies really well, of ecological patterns of interdependency, and how we are in the business of fine-tuning our methods and concepts in order to do justice to these ecological dynamics. Of course, much of the world goes the other way around. They go exactly the opposite way. Much of politics goes exactly the opposite way. The past weeks have been seeing this news, the UK government turning its back to some of the green policies and targets in what Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, calls more pragmatic, proportionate and realistic approach. This was echoed by the Swedish government and their similar turn in policies and de facto potentially going against even their own climate law that stipulates that the requirement to reduce, not increase, carbon dioxide emissions, which all comes nicely together to the point made by a group of Portuguese youth who took 32 countries to the European Court of Human Rights due to the inadequacy of current measures to tackle global warming and other risks. This is where all kinds of features of biopolitics, necropolitics, and so forth meet. It is fundamentally about the governance in relation to timescales of dynamic change, of the way in which we look back at the current moment from the 2050s, 2060s, 2070s, and so forth. We can speak of this in terms of a planetary futurism as a backdrop of governance of bodies now that is really at the same time fundamentally about a very different scale of bios, of the planetary, a material blob that is also the condition of life and the condition of governance of life. The shift from speaking in terms of global to speaking in terms of planetary is a key designating term in the past years of humanities as well, and design and art. As the lineage of thinkers from Spivak to Achille Mbembe to Dipesh Chakrabarti and many others notes, the planet itself is not a given, it's an uneven, discontinuous, constantly unevenly produced, materially multiple kind of a surface of an entity that itself is constantly indeed produced. The planet is a body, but is not one. It is not one body. It is a multiplicity of bodies, of incorporating critiques of political geography of post-colonial and decolonial kinds. What's more, such projects such as Benjamin Bratton's Antiquera program, they aim to think of scales of computation as planetary, adding a further layer to the question as to conditions of life in technological terms. In short, the planetary is also synthetic. This synthesis comes through many forms and many scales. It relates to figures of subjectivity of humans and non-humans, but also modes of knowing. And I'm curious about these models of knowing that come about in these terms as well. I hold some of these questions of the planetary very dear to me due to the capacity to think of these scales of expanded bodies indeed. But we shouldn't, of course, ignore another thing that is very dear to me, the models already provided in earlier critical studies that are parallel to this topic or this theme of the planetary. The work in critical post-humanities, the kind of critical post-humanities that comes from feminism and post-colonial studies and queer studies, is a good example of thinking that shifts us beyond the figures of unified subjects, those fantasies of male white European subjects, and addressing the multiple scales of ecology as they interlink with the rethinking of much more radical forms of material fleshy subjectivities and their histories. This includes the nature cultural forces at play and the sort of Zoe instead of mere bios that Rosie Braidotti emphasizes as the true material fleshy core of the issue. While obviously and for good reasons bios comes to play as these slices of governance, of organizational capacities to know and to modify bodies that we have inherited and we're working with, as we just heard, and include the political aspect of trying to channel life as part of state or corporate and other models of organizations. Zoe resides in Braidotti's works as this dynamic, self-organizing structure of life itself, something more vital, something more dynamic in those terms, with more than a hint of similar patterns as in philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari's thinking in terms of molecular and molar, Foucault's thinking of pouvoir and puissance, as well as various influences indeed from feminist, post and decolonial accounts. This aspect of Zoe politics and that Zoe political mode of post-humanism comes to stand as one way of formulating the expanded. It is not just extensively expanded, but intensively so, as it cuts through the particular multi-scalar materials of bodies that are mapped through their capacities, right? While we are into and interested in understanding what administration and data do in terms of practices and operations, we should not lose sight of the excess, the residual, and the dynamic powers of life. This applies not just to animal life, but the broader ecological situation, as it features these intermingling attempts to know these dynamics that resist simplifying models of knowing. The attempt to live with the sort of ecological patterns that exceed anthropocentrism, and the attempt to care for, while the caring, in the radical ethical sense, as many have pointed out, is radically intersectional, including ecology, that by necessity is at the same time known through those technoscientific systems that are also part of the problem. It is indeed the shit we're in. So what does this mean in the contemporary context? Well, we already heard this in the previous presentations of the versions of where biopolitics turn to zoopolitics and they turn back into each other and they fold into each other. They could be, for example, the models of statistical governance and mobilization of data in and beyond machine learning as well, but also in relation to large-scale population governance measures, such as during the pandemic. They could be the biotechnical capitalism that we just heard from Heather in really beautiful terms, and the modulation of life in those terms, such as work of Melinda Cooper has also pointed out. But it also expands these really interesting interfaces, such as agriculture and food systems and their role in reorganizing planetary surfaces, and how this biopolitics becomes about logistics. The long history of agriculture is interesting already as a part of the changes of Earth's atmosphere. But in the more recent years, also systems of smart agriculture and datafication of supposedly rural spaces are an extended angle to these expanded bodies. And then very closely related, the discourses and technologies of geoengineering are closely related. The planet or large-scale planetary areas are also seen as design environments, often but not exclusively about techno-fixes. And we know the critiques already. And also in broader terms, the questions of carbon capture and the multitude of solutions needed to sustain life. This might be just some of the examples of the mass-scale refurbishing of planetary politics, which also scale down to some detailed levels of human and non-human bodies. Even if each one of these topics and themes and bodies and scales is its own thematic area of concerns, there are ways to see how they are cross-cut by, let's say, by instruments or by concerns or by infrastructures that are somehow related. At least certain terms help us to see resonance between the different practices. There are particular concepts indeed and processes that help to make things of how these particular notions like images and data participate in many of these aspects, and how the biopolitical thus becomes also about governance by way of these little instruments, such as operational images, that in some ways also try to capture the zoe, the dynamics of ecological life. My recent book on the topic of operational images was an attempt to expand on Harun Farocki's original concept and work in a way, and to tie it into some of the ways in which bio and geopolitical questions of contemporary visual culture exist and take these things forward as well. The original idea of operational images as technical images that primarily operate in systems, such as autonomous systems, related to practices of sensing and interaction, real-time or almost real-time sensing, and incorporate these image practices that do not necessarily come out as images in the traditional sense as much as processes of navigation, of targeting, optimization, of routing, and so forth. Often the term is seen conflating with the history of technical imaging in military systems, and similarly, as recently has been shown, the automation of image interpretation during Cold War feeds of course into the broader legacy of operational images now in relation to computer vision, to read all kinds of surfaces, like we were talking about surfaces and the ways in which surface becomes the interface for these systems, to read terrains as one reads subjects through their surfaces. But also the instrumental uses of images in design and architectural modeling would be a great example that I'm really interested in, and where the notion of ontogenesis works by way of literally design environments, and how these become these little instruments by way of which worlds are being enacted, and the ways in which these operational images gather a particular kind of a gravitas in concrete practices. And of course, much of architecture theory has also been following similar patterns. I'm thinking there would be several great writers there, but for instance, Theodora Vardulis's take on graph vision is a great example of very detailed work of looking into transformation of notion of images and graphs and how they are entangled in computational contexts of design. In this process, I would say that the scope of operational images turns primarily from military imaging to different spheres of management of bodies, something that really relates closely to my colleague and friend Pasi Väliaho's term biopolitical screens. For Väliaho, biopolitics is in this key about visual economies and these digital environments which prompt actions. They prompt cognitive and affective patterns and habits. And I think this notion of prompting through particular kinds of discursive and material technologies was very much present in my colleagues' talks today already. And then these other forms of mobilization of perceptual worlds of subjects. This we use decisively about the subject, though, and this really well demonstrates the role of visual media in these operations. But I'm interested in question of what would be a similar kind of an operational image beyond the human subjects, and how does it prompt different forms of transformation of operations of thinking through landscapes and other ecological spheres in ways that is parallel perhaps to the mode of biopolitics focused on affect and humans, for instance. How do operational images participate in this explicit and latent management of ecological dynamics and this aspect of Zoe politics as well? In operational images, I try to address some of these implications of this mode of management by way of images. I'm interested in, of course, of the regimes of perceptual change that comes about in AI and the notions of visuality there, but I'm also interested in geopolitical shifts, including environmental issues that also links to a different kind of a regime of security that is not just, and not to belittle conflict or military conflict, far from it, but it's also about operations other than war. And this is an interesting theme in itself. I'll just kind of skim through a couple of bits before I close the talk. It's an interesting way of sort of extending the idea of modulation of bodies, human, non-human, ecological, and such as well. It's not a non-military form of power, but one that builds on a particular logistical capacities and systemic technological potentials that are primed for contemporary planetary situation. From environmental situations or issues to humanitarian assistance, to enforcement of exclusion zones, to handling of pandemics, as well as this extended sphere of conflict, for instance, in terms of what Rosie Braidotti and Matthew Fuller talk about as part of the expanded conflict, and the ways in which particular media techniques come to play a role in these operations as well, that I won't go into, but it sort of nicely relates to all kinds of questions about images, misinformation, but also this manipulative forms of prompting affects, right, that we are aware of, perhaps sometimes in different terms as well. So we can ask what format of operational images participate in this state of war and non-war, of violence and its alternative forms, that is not merely about real-time imaging, not the sort of explosive nature of necropolitical destruction, right? But of different scales of time through which we've been prompted through ecological transformations as well, right? It all resonates with earlier theorization of not just war and media, but media and the non-battle as a mode of conditioning. And I'm very aware of the time, and I'll finish soon. And I won't go into this. I'll just skip a couple of things, but I just want to mention about this sort of extended time scales to come into play when we shift to questions of, for instance, non-battle or soft power in those terms, and what would be the question of operational images that participate in creating conditions in which you wait, in which you're acting on the conditions in which something might be happening or might not be happening. And this might be intuitive in relation to, for instance, a very actionable situation, again, a military or whatever, but also I'm curious of what this would mean in terms of the broad ecological management of non action, for instance, right? I kind of want to finish with this couple of notes. The ways in which these forms of imaging practices are indeed about ontogenesis, about creation of reality in the most material forms alongside discursive forms. They relate to three things that I'll finish with. First one is the obvious one. These forms of images and the recursive force is about knowing bodies, knowing the different scales of bodies and management of bodies of different scales, right? But they also modes of knowing and manipulating terrains and landscapes. And this becomes a really interesting way in which photographic and post-photographic practices have been looking into things like remote sensing, and where recursion becomes a central element of modes of imaging that are there to action a particular potential transformation of a landscape, for instance, right? Extraction industries would be a good example. There would be another story as well. I wanted to put this up there as well about what landscape means in relation to digital media, that is not just the traditional landscape, but digital media itself as a landscape, like in some art projects like Stephen Cornford's up there as well. But I'll skip that in the interest of time, because then thirdly, it's not just about the ways in which a particular visible environment is being conditioned as technogeography, to use Jennifer Gabrus's term, but the ways in which climate is being modeled and the ways in which these patterns of those terms that I mentioned earlier come to condition also through climate models, right? So there's something really interesting about scales and the modes of creating conditions of livability and habitability in that future sense that comes to act upon the current moment now. Just to finish with this, in the interest of time, and of course it's all about recursions. It's about the ways in which recursion functions as a particular concrete technique. I'm interested in the concrete ways in which particular imaging and knowledge practices are there to enact particular transformations in those situations of which the images again emerge. It's a sort of a feedback loop, but of a recursive kind, which also brings back the question of importance of images in those terms and the ways in which we can think of perhaps ecological dynamics, like biopolitics, as part of recursive dynamics. It's been overly theoretical or at least discursive, but I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Jussi. Thank you. Thank you very much for all your references and visions that are, personally speaking, very, very interesting to my researches and my upcoming book. And what I would like to ask you, within your fascinating and wide and complex, more than wide, layered theoretical research is, I mean, how do you think the balance of, you talk about dynamics, you use the word dynamics a few times, I mean, and so what do you think the balance of this, I can say, agentive, basically, dimension, which is also subject of your last book, in the creation, physical creations of sites and situations in which we live, is gradually and quickly shifting from being generated by humans, even if we think that was generated only by humans, that the agentive dimensions belong only to humans, but it's now quite evident that it's really shifting from humans to more and more, on one side artificial, on the other side biological, differently intelligent systems, you know, especially I mean those related to or connected, you know, to this wide idea of body that you talked about, not only human body, but of course also biological and political body. There is I mean, the feeling, not only from the post-human philosophy, but I mean, not only theoretically, but practically, you know, that the agentive dimension in the formulation and the creation, physical creations of sites and situations is really shifting. Don't you agree? Which is your opinion about it?
Yeah, no, exactly. It's my own fault that I sort of prompt really big questions by being sort of slightly discursively wide. Hence the question is difficult, but I think there's a really nice two intersecting poles there as well. As you know, I've been interested in exactly of what kinds of modeling of media are happening quite concretely beyond the human model, whether this is in robotics or whether it's in artificial life systems or what we would now call multi-agent modeling or, simulation systems and whatnot, that some sort of seem to pick up on exactly the point of that agential is something of a dynamic of multiple agents of all kinds of figurations, whether it's used to be swarms and so forth. And it's two intersecting poles that are super interesting there as well. On the one hand, many of us, and me too as well, in certain ways are firm believers that going beyond anthropocentrism is the philosophical, theoretical, but also the activist way of understanding particular forms of, I dare to say, liberation, or let's say, particular progressive political projects. And I believe that is the case. Still, queer ecologies to this kind of critical post-humanities that thinks beyond anthropocentrism. And yet at the same time is parallel to the ways in which increasingly efficient modes of capture are able to try to do the same, of trying to think beyond the human form, despite the fact that we're kind of on a discursive level return to the most retarded forms of sort of politics in multiple countries. I don't need to name these politics, you know what I'm talking about, for forms of whether it's xenophobic or neo-Nazis or just plain conservative stupidity and whatnot. But at the same time, like at the very basis is that modes of capture indeed in the capitalist forms of capture that really try to tap into this Zoe as well, right? So we got this paradox of like trying to deal with these same notions of non-humans as well, while at the same time it's being increasingly captured. And this is probably the axis where the difficulty of agency is also being thought through as well, and the ways in which we are committed to thinking through agency that is beyond the usual figurations of the subject, and thinking through scale, for instance, in those terms as well, but not anymore having any kind of a naive feelings that this is going to be itself the solution, right? Because there's such effective forms of, integrating all of these as well. But of course, it was already in feminist technosciences and whatnot, it was always the strength that it was that admittance that much of our critical thinking happens in conditions that are not conditions of any kind of purity. We're in the middle of techno-scientific sort of models and worldings already, and we're sort of trying to maneuver in that space with critical thinking as well. So the position of immanence into these sort of systems is really interesting and difficult as well. In terms of just beyond that, addressing agency is probably a big question that we can think in terms of these other talks as well, and perhaps there's something there that resonates with my with Zach and Heather with the question as well.
Thank you, Jussi. Thank you very much for your feedbacks. Okay, we are here at the final step of this wonderful lecture meeting. And so I would like to invite also Zach and Heather to join the conversation. And first of all, thank you all very much for your fantastic presentations and insights in your work practice, and inspiring and provoking, many thinking to me, and I'm sure also to the audience. There is a question that in the chat that could be a good starting point. I'm asking this question from Digital Easy. That I think I know this account anyway, but I don't remember. And it's a question for all of you studying. We can follow the sequence, Zach, Heather, and Jussi again. And I mean, I try to squeeze because it's a question split in two questions. So, what's your opinion about about the governments? Okay, about the politics. So how and why the governments are having accesses and keeping, this huge data concerning not only, as we were discussing with Jussi, to our human bodies, but to a general general idea of body in terms also of artificial bodies and biological bodies. And so how we as a citizen could face, what is happening in terms of collecting and misuse and categorization of this new kind of or second generation of Farojki operational images. And the second part of the question was connected to this one also. How we can, I mean, if the governments should defend us also when these data are and will be probably more and more connected and collected by private companies. So I know it's a big question, and what is your opinion about it, Zach?
I don't know if I'm the right person to start with on this one. I'm going to give you a disappointing answer. I mean, I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that, and in fact, in this more recent work, I'm kind of moving through things in my work, and I'm not at a place of kind of focusing on resistance yet. Like I'm making some work that's focusing more on power structures. It's like I kind of come in and out of that, and I'm just not in that place where I'm thinking about that right now. But I mean, what I was going to say as you were talking was just in terms of thinking about the control or gathering of data. I mean, I definitely think it's obviously a tangle of private corporations and governments. I mean, even at least in the research that I've done more specifically around Silicon Valley in California, and of course that's like quite widely known. So I mean, maybe like I would just I maybe throw a question back and which is I think what my work is looking at, and I mean I guess it's a provocative thing to think about, but it's just something I'm like really interested in and taken with right now. Is of course there are all moments and instances where data is kind of forced to be extracted, it's taken without us knowing. But I guess within what I've been thinking about with this work and previous work before that is, why is there the kind of will and desire to also give it up? And that's kind of the bit of the, I guess, the complicity that I was talking about. I was really taken. I've been thinking about this for a number of years, and there's a book written by a scholar in Columbia. He's at Columbia. His name is Bernard Harcourt. He wrote this book called Exposed that I found really useful a number of years ago, where he argued that we were living in an expository society, and one of the main ways in which power works is that it harnesses the pleasure and the desire that we have to kind of submit and let information be extracted and gathered. That's not the full story, but I guess that would be my response around what I've been thinking about.
I was muted. I'm sorry. Thank you, Zach.
Shall I go next? Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to have this kind of disembodied question and not know anything about the person asking it, because I think with this in particular, I mean, with so many things, but with this question, it's so much about who and where you are. And it kind of brings me back again to this question, this kind of Foucault's question about what is the main danger. Because depending on where you're sitting in the world and what your identity is, the government might be a bigger threat, or the private corporations might be a bigger threat. So, and I've sat in different positions myself. I mean, so and time has also changed, and who's in the government changes, and all of these circumstances contribute to an overall kind of security question about your data and what it means and what your concerns are about it. So for me right now, sitting in the United States in a democratic government, my biggest concern right now is really about the private corporations and their handling of the data at the moment. And of course, that can't be, it's not as if the government handling of data can be separated from the corporate, because governments contract with corporate to handle data. So it's almost never that something is really just governmental. There's almost always some kind of private entanglement with that happening. Private contractors, private companies storing things, people that have access to the things. And so my big concern right now, very practically speaking, is about how our data is being weaponized for undemocratic purposes. And but I'm clearly very concerned about that because we have an upcoming presidential election in the United States that will have dramatic biopolitical impacts on me and on people that I care about, on the general population. So that very much frames how I'm seeing that question and the context around that in this moment in time. Well, there are other moments in my life where I've sat in other countries where I had very pressing concerns about the government relationship to my data and what the government knew about me, because there were practices that I engaged in that were on the wrong side of governmentality in that sense. So again, it's really just, it's so contextual. And since I don't know who you are or where you're sitting or what your identity is, it's very hard to answer kind of which aspect of that is the most pressing, but they both are in different ways and in ways that build upon each other.
Yeah, I can echo exactly what Heather said as well, that it really depends on those kinds of both geographical ways in which this might have a very different kind of an answer, but also in terms of what again, the sort of a regime of biopolitics are we dealing with in relation to very concrete human biopolitics. Those points that were made are exactly spot on in terms of weaponization of data. I'm sitting in Aarhus in Denmark, where in the midst of relatively, and again, many lawyers might point out that that's not exactly the case, but relatively progressive, regulation of particular commercial data, for instance, compared to some other parts of the world, we're still sitting in the context of a radical weaponization of borders as far as Europe is concerned, and especially against asylum seekers, refugees, and so forth. So the sort of ways in which particular forms of datafication function as part of this ultra-racist border politics of, for instance, Denmark, is a case in point of quite clear cut of questions of ethnicity. And this form of critical post-humanities is not about the non-human only. It's about really of what kind of bodies are being targeted and in which kinds of measures and with very material repercussions. There's an interesting story, of course, and this would be super long, and I don't have any kind of a nice one-liner, but the question of environmental data in those terms is interesting and multiple, because it in a historical perspective then intersects with questions of Cold War sensorial systems, remote sensing, the ways in which open data becomes a thing gradually since 1970s onwards as part of environmental management of planetary sphere, without losing any of its sort of doesn't come nice, cute and cuddly and green, without losing any of its sort of a political impact in those terms as well, or power impact as well. Perhaps it becomes part of this supposedly soft power. A good case or sort of example is in the Operational Images book. I talk about the work of GeoCinema, the artist duo who done field work in China on Digital Belt and Road Initiative, the ways in which remote sensing for sustainability initiatives and the massive data collection, data infrastructures are also mobilized as part of this extensive data soft power regimes of bargaining with data in relation to with such nation states, for instance, who don't have access to such massive data in terms of crisis management, crisis prevention, and other forms. So you can see that there's all kinds of layers there that relate to the question of, again, geopolitics of data, including through sustainability and remote sensing and all kinds of forecasting measures. And there would be another story to be said about that sort of a wider data regime, of course, in terms of persecution of Muslim minorities, for instance, in China. So this is a point made by a wonderful scholar and colleague, Xiaoling Ma, in some of her recent work in Critical Inquiry journal as well, about the sort of extended motions of datafication in those terms as well. This is a bit broad answer, but it sort of points to these two things and about geographical locations and perhaps different regimes of data and how they might be mobilized in relation to those questions of power and persecution and whatnot.
Yeah. Listening to all of you and all your opinion that, of course, I totally embrace. I was thinking about the fact that we are here and we are two artists and two curators and theorists. I mean, so and studying again from UC, you had the experience this summer to be part of the curatorial team of the Helsinki Biennale. And so, I mean, I was thinking, what should be, in your opinion, the role of contemporary art system in this regard? I mean, in order to reach a wider audience and have a real impact in a way on the society in which we live. I mean, not to limit itself activating still variable exhibition processes, and it is already doing, okay, to some extent, more and more, but to work on also on another dimension more and more as well, fostering a critical interdisciplinary dialogue and an activity that is also linked to direct polities on the territory. What's your opinion about it, both from the curatorial side and from the artistic side?
Yeah. So if I go first briefly?
Yes.
That's a great question. I probably also don't have like a great one-liner answer, but I think that this and again, my artist friends here might have a much more informed answer as well. But the ways in which the two dangers, at least from my perspective, in terms of contemporary art and technological arts as well, is that the other danger is the sort of solutionism that is being imposed sometimes on arts. Get an artist to fix it. We got these planetary scale problems, so we need an artistic creative angle, which is sort of a weird. There's a long history of Cold War legacy of this as well. I'm exaggerating, but it's bit of that. And then the other one is that, okay, this art is just conscious, raising consciousness, being more aware of there's a bad thing called climate crisis. And those are probably the two things that I'm sort of trying to avoid in all kinds of ways in terms of talking about art, and which leads into all kinds of ways in which artistic practices like described here are really interesting as practices, not just artistic works, and the ways in which, and this is just one slice of a big great pile of contemporary art projects that does many of these things really well, is investigative work. And a somewhat obvious answer, but because we've been hearing and reading so much and seeing so much forensic architecture over the past years. For instance, Helsinki Biennial had one of the commissions was Nabil Ahmed and Interpret Group's project on Northern Sami issues in relation to wind energy, in relation to land rights, and hence all kinds of questions of biopolitics in those terms as well. And I sort of find that there's a sort of an extended research angle to these aspects, while at the same time being able to reach, of course, bigger audiences. And we're opening next week with Daphne Dragona in Gijón, in Spain, Motores del Clima.
Yeah.
Exhibition as well. We sort of try to deal with the question of axis of technological arts about, broadly speaking, climate in relation to questions of climate justice, as part of this framing that is somewhere at the intersection of epistemic and aesthetic projects that range from really again, a bit in the spirit of what I mentioned, Susan Shipley's work on weaponization of coldness, and in other words, artificial temperature control in relation to, for instance, the sort of cruel regimes against immigrants, for instance, in North America, to many other forms of, let's say, understanding the climate itself as this multiple axis of issues of that really moves beyond aesthetics without trying to become solutionists in any kind of way. Okay, I'm getting off track soon, so better hand it to these two.
Say hello to Daphne.
Yes, I will. I don't know if either Heather or Zach will want to say something that is much more reasonable than
Heather,
No,
please.
yeah, no, go ahead. I think that you made really, really nice points. And, you know, what I was thinking, like sitting here in the US, Zach and I actually talk about this fairly frequently, how much we show work in Europe. And, you know, why is that the case? It's because there is more support and more of an audience for critical conversations around technology and science and these kinds of things. And there's a lot of, coming back to the government, there's a lot of government funding directed towards the arts and directed towards critical artistic projects, whereas in the US, you know, things are clearly much more commercial. And so there's less oriented towards that. And so I just thought that was kind of interesting sitting here with Zach and thinking about that, because it's something that we've talked about a lot. But, you know, there's so many contexts that I've entered into where, for me, I guess what I want to say is that as an artist, one of the things that I've found really interesting is that my art brings me to lots of different places. And I mean, not just geographically, but in the sense of entering into, for example, policy conversations, science museums, you know, places that aren't just the kind of white cube of the gallery or the museum. And that is, for me, one of the really interesting things is when it spills out of just a purely artistic context and kind of mixes in with all of these other avenues of potential.
Thank you, Heather. And Zach, you cannot avoid it.
Yeah, I think what you both said is very beautifully put. I mean,
You're opening,
what I was going to say,
you're opening an exhibition in London next week. I mean, in a couple of weeks, right?
yes.
Okay.
I mean, what I was going to say is, I mean, just because I was also thinking about, I wasn't thinking specifically about Europe, but Heather is right. And I mean, one of the things that I always think of with staging an exhibition is making a claim and holding space for the discursive within it. And that's very often easily done in Europe, but it can be like a big challenge in North America. And so that's something that I think about a lot when I'm putting on an exhibition, like regardless of how just because I will make work that's you know, challenging, and it can be you know, maybe difficult to grasp, but I also think there's different ways that's even framed within North America and Europe, broadly speaking, where I find that North American museums tend to have an approach where material has to be dumbed down for an audience, which is assuming the audience isn't smart enough or, you know, intellectually curious enough to engage at a certain level. That's often not as much of a problem in Europe. So just there are some specificities here with place and location and the museum or institution you're working with and how a public has a relationship with that. But to me, this point of, you know, carving out the discursive in relationship to the show, and that can practically look like organizing, you know, a series of lectures around the exhibition, or like I like to stage, you know, lecture performances, which to me, I think of the work in the lecture performance as variation on a theme. There's something you can do with an experiential media installation, right, that you can't do with a lecture performance and vice versa, or giving a talk. They each have their limitations and affordances. And to me, I like to inhabit those multiple modes because they, you know, communicate and emphasize different things.
Zach, I wanted to use your final words as a conclusion of this meeting, and on a personal note, okay, I can say I want to ask to all of you how and if it's still important today, according also to your past experiences. Also, Heather was talking about a Gen Space in New York, and you see also your past experiences, maybe also some years ago, and how it's important to all of you the process of sharing, okay? Sharing your practice, your research, not simply and only with an audience, but I mean with communities, okay, made of scientists, theorists, activists, or students, of course, or even common people, and to foster eventually open or DIY or collective processes of appropriation, you know, of cultural knowledge tools and even tactics and strategies. Because for me, it's really very important. Okay, at this point of my life and in the world in which we are living, it's a more and more important point. It was, of course, in the last years, but it's becoming more and more really urgent. So I wanted to come to an end with a personal note from all of you about it. Starting from Zach, you were talking about this.
I mean, it's not surprising that all of us are engaged in teaching in some various degrees. So, you know, I think there's a certain level of commitment there, and I think you know, having those kinds of encounters. I mean, it's here. I can give you maybe an interesting example of this. When I was making my work, the facial recognition work, facial weaponization suite, I was running these workshops with people in different places. And, you know, looking back on those, I realized those in a way were kind of consciousness raising workshops, even though I didn't think about it like that at the time. But one of the things we did was we would read a series of theoretical texts on different articulations of withdrawal or escape or invisibility, you know, across a range of like ontological positions or tactics, whether it's Agamben's whatever singularity or Galois Thacker's tactics of non-existence. And, you know, what I learned from that was by reading these theoretical texts with a group of people, everyone would be like on board with these ideas, but there were certain ideas that the groups would gravitate toward. And I felt like by holding this experience of kind of teaching and sharing in a workshop, you know, I learned a lot about, you know, a theoretical text might speak to you, but there's something else about like affectively wanting to corral around a piece of work. It's not the same thing. And so, you know, by running this workshop, it's actually what led me to all my work on opacity all those years ago, because what I noticed was that people did not want to corral around like illegibility or non-existence or invisibility, those, even if they, you know, resonated with the theoretical claims. And so like opacity, in all those different workshops with so many different types of people across the US and Mexico, was just this, it was the most capacious. And, you know, I was really struck by that because I was actually personally a little more attracted to one of the more negative formulations. But like based on those experiences, I rerouted and decided to focus on opacity through those experiences. That's just like one example of kind of thinking about, I don't know, like synergies and, you know, like intellectual transformations that can happen in that encounter when you're kind of thinking and imagining together.
Thank you, Zach. Guys?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I was getting at that a bit in my last comment, that it is this multimodal thing, and it is, of course, the point. I mean, what is the point of making art? It's to share it, and to share, you know, when you're making this kind of critical work, it's definitely about sharing ideas also. And so I'm just trying to even think of how to answer it because it's so all encompassing in a way. When you asked the question, I was thinking that in some ways in making this kind of practice, it's like I almost never get a break from sharing because, you know, even just like when you meet new people, it's this fundamental thing that always happens at a party. It's what do you do? Oh, I'm an artist. Oh, what kind of art do you make? You know, and then you're immediately in it. And then it's like you are immediately sharing this information again about all of these issues and biopolitics and things. And so I feel like it manifests itself in so many different forms that range from like the party conversation on one end, the classroom, the gallery, workshops, organizing conferences. I do also curating sometimes, exactly. I mean, working also with kids and communities, it just has taken shape in so many different ways. And yeah, and that is of course the point, is to figure out how to make work that on some level, it doesn't mean it has to be dumbed down, but that on some level connects with people and draws them in to these topics, these questions, and these provocations.
Yeah, great.
Jussi.
Yeah, this is why I don't go to parties.
Yeah.
Jokes aside, no, I do go to classroom, and I like being in a classroom, and so that's good. So many good things already said. I used to be a journalist in a way for years before I sort of finished my PhD, and then sort of became more of an academic. And the beauty of journalism, at least that aspect of it, was the realization that I don't need to really know anything. I can always ask, and the other person will be most likely an expert and know a lot. So trying to cultivate the sort of a like getting away from the anxiety of not knowing to being able to work with others, and in those terms of being able to be quite responsive to this sort of a expertise, and hence exposing also to contexts which are not replicas of oneself. In other words, all kinds of things that were mentioned again as well, different institutional contexts, different disciplines, artistic worlds, but also different geographical areas. This sounds now that it's going into this sort of a like just a praising of plurality, but of course it partly is. But I think it's just about this recognition of these forms of collaborative work in those terms, where it also becomes quite an ethically good mandate to try to enable other people in terms of their sort of work. And that's what I also actually start to enjoy, is that the process academic, it's education and it's doing all this kind of research and talks and whatnot, but it's also like then sometimes being in position, which is rare, to whether if somebody has a budget or so, being able to enable other people to do some things that are meaningful and hopefully also progressive in the sort of a bigger sense as well, that we are still committed into as well in terms of politics. So something along those lines in this, without any more grandiose statements from me.
Thank you. Okay, time has come. I want to express my warmest and the heartiest thanks to all of you guys. Thank you very much. I want to thank also all the people who are watching and for joining us. I want to thank the team at Generation who have done such a tremendous work in the past weeks and today to bring this conference to light. And I'm grateful to EMAP Network for giving me the chance, to create and lead this wonderful and I hope inspiring conversation. I hope you enjoyed, and that's it. I wish you a wonderful evening and look forward to see you all again. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for.
Thank you.